I think if we begin now, we can beat the famous quarto d'ora accademico, which, as those of you know, voi che siete italiani conoscono benissimo questo costume per il quarto d'ora accademico, ma ce lo facciamo di ridurre il quarto d'ora accademico in 10 minuti. So I'm just saying we're going to begin early, in other words, 10 minutes late. That I think will be the last of the paradoxes this evening, although one never knows what paradoxes either the mind of Leonardo or the mind of Paolo Galluzzi can produce. So welcome to you all. I take it as testimony to the fact that you all know Professor Galluzzi so well that we have managed to fill our theatre this evening. But I'm sure that you will be rewarded with a great lecture as Professor Galluzzi habitually gives. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening, Paolo. And I'm going to say just a very few words as we wait for people to come in, and I raise perhaps not a paradox, but one of those challenges to our knowledge of how human beings work. Because when you think of Paolo Galluzzi and you consider the astonishing museum which he has set up in Florence, and when you consider the vast range of his publications, which we have all now lost counting, so I won't mention many of them at all, there are over 200 of them. When you consider this combination of running a major museum, successfully, I should say, these days in Italy, one doesn't know how he does it. So perhaps we will get some insight this evening. Most of you will probably have visited at one point or another in your lives, and if you haven't, you should. The Museo, as it used to be called, the Museo di Storia della Scienza in Florence. It's now become, as a tribute to one of the great Tuscan scientists, the Museo Galileo. But the real achievement, I think, of Paolo, in addition to his scholarly work, has really been to build up this museum in these extraordinarily difficult times for culture and museums in Italy. One of the great pleasures that I have had has been to go through the museum with Paolo Galluzzi as he explains a whole series of the most, I mean, you will all remember the great machines there, the great scientific instruments, the extraordinary engineering operations that it required to build the great machines that viewed the stars and the seas. And Paolo Galluzzi knows exactly how they worked and exactly how to explain them to one. And this talent, which I've had the personal pleasure of experiencing, has also now been transformed into one of the great sort of technological wonders of the museums of our times, because you can take with you a device which will explain to you everything that you can possibly want to know, both in terms of technique and in terms of history within that museum. So Paolo Galluzzi, not surprisingly, is one of the major experts of our time in three, I think there may well be 4 or 5 or 6, but certainly in 3 dominant fields in the history of science: the study of Galileo, the study of Leonardo, and the study of the engineering aspects of the history of science, as my small account of his tour around the museum with me has already indicated. He knows the history of engineering in the Renaissance and has written a great deal on the subject. He knows about mathematical puzzles, he knows about complicated machines, but at the same time, as is witnessed by the great library that has been built up in the Museo Galileo, he is also, as his articles testify, an expert on the manuscripts themselves, on the major books that have accompanied the study of science in the 17th and 18th century. So he goes from Leonardo and onwards. This is not to say that he doesn't know about the medieval period as well, but this has been his major focus. So you would have thought that as this museum has been built up into a model museum of its kind. I mean, it's not like the American Museum of Natural History, which has vast amounts of space. It's quite astonishing how much is concentrated into the small space of the Museo Galileo in Florence. But even so, he has managed to continue his publishing activities, and, you know, instead of going through the books which he has written on the engineers of the Renaissance, Leonardo and the proportion, and a whole series of studies of Galileo, I'm just going to mention 3 articles which he's just done in the last few years. I mean, he's written again on the wonderful moments of the display by Galileo through his telescope of the sunspots, which he did on the Quirinale in 1611. He's written more about art and artifice in the depiction of Renaissance machines. That's the sort of thing which is very complicated for the rest of us who are embedded in text to follow, but he weaves his way through the complexities of the gears and cogs of Renaissance machines and their representation in art. And then, of course, he's continued to think about how best to present science to the public in our time. And so there's a series of articles as well on we just had a misunderstanding about the relationship between aspetti giuridici and aspetti turistici when I was explaining about a talk which one of our fellows gave today on Guicciardini, and Professor Galluzzi thought I had said that we were talking about touristic aspects of Guicciardini, but when in fact we were talking about juristic aspects of Guicciardini. But he has to get back to the touristic. Professor Galluzzi never leaves this far from his mind, and he is concerned with the visitor to the museum, and he is concerned with the fact that the visitor must be a serious visitor at the same time as making art acceptable. So I think, you know, I just want to, there is sort of a rather wonderful title of a book which he recently, now a while back actually, in the late 90s, co-edited, called I formati della memoria, the formats of memory, beni culturali, cultural resources and new technologies at the beginning of the 3rd millennium. And this is really what Paolo Galluzzi has devoted his life to, without ever abandoning his commitment to real history, to real work in the archives, to real thinking about those most complicated of minds we have, about one of whom he's going to speak to us this evening. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Paolo Galluzzi this evening, who will talk to us about Leonardo, and in particular the title called The Shadow of Light, Leonardo's Mind by Candlelight. Paolo Galluzzi, welcome to the Italian Academy.
Well, thank you for your by far too generous presentation. I hope you will enjoy the lecture and you will, at the end, have understood this funny title I have selected. I need my machine, here it is, yeah. A double folio for a total of 4 pages in the Codex Atlanticus. This is the recto of the double folio and this is the verso, quite long and organic, at least by Leonardo's standards, bears the title On the Motion of the Flame. And you will see now coming out and then reverse in mirror image del moto della fiamma, of the motion of the flame. The folio may be dated to 1509-10. During this period, Leonardo continuously commutes between Milan and Florence. He is immersed in studies of optics, like this beautiful double sheet again, on the projection of sun rays on a circular left or parabolic mirror, right, on the flight of birds, as well as hydraulics and anatomy. His artistic activity focuses on the preparation of the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne and Saint John the Baptist, both paintings preserved today at the Louvre. The layout of our folio mirrors the graphic structure characteristics of the Codex Leicester. You see on the left our page, and on the right the Codex Leicester. Same mise en page, same layout. It's the same thing also other codices of the same period display the same layout, like the manuscript F and the manuscript G in Paris, as well as many other folios in the Codex Atlanticus in Milan, in the Royal Collection at Windsor, as well as in the Codex Arundel in London. In all of these manuscripts, we observe a column of small sketchy figures in the right margin with an imposing block of text occupying the rest of the page. This layout draws inspiration from the mathematical treatises like that of this Incunabolo by Euclid and Archimedes. This is a manuscript in the Laurentiana Library in Florence that Leonardo is intensely studying in this period. Compared to the chaotic distribution of drawings accompanied by extremely concise annotations in early Leonardo's manuscripts, like this one, the dominating function assigned to textual exposition in our folio reflects his efforts at this stage of his career to articulate a more organic and epistemologically complex reasoning. Leonardo's investigation starts by analyzing the motion of the flame, which tends to move upward at a constantly increasing speed. He then focuses his attention on the shape of the flame. It is at this point that Leonardo's reasoning, based up to now on the principles of Aristotle's theory of the elements, begins to assimilate the input from direct observation of the candle that sheds light on his working desk. Not just one, but numerous candles, since Leonardo's visual demonstration of the pyramidal shape of a flame results from experiments in which 3 lighted candles are placed close together, as you can see in this detail of our sheet. Quote, if each of the bases of a number of equal flames will be all contingent, they will make a continuous flame, which, having sufficient and continuous nourishment, will produce a pyramidal fire, which is similar in shape to each of the aforesaid individual flames. End of quote. Into the context of abstract reflections on the elements and powers of nature, there thus erupts the simple day-to-day reality of a lighted candle destined to assume the role of protagonist in the development of his analysis. For Leonardo, the phenomenology of a candle's flame constitutes a word in miniature, in which the universal laws of nature can be seen at work. It is clear that Leonardo's mind, although fascinated by the possibility of deducing natural effects from general principles, prefers to grasp these principles in action, in observable phenomena, or in those produced through ingenious experiments, often of astonishing simplicity, such as the operation of placing 3 lighted candles close together in order to observe the merging of their flames. The flames of those humble candles, we might say, illuminate the mind of Leonardo even more clearly than does scrutiny of the philosophical sources of his reasoning. The latter, however, will continue to be interwoven with the results of his observations and experiments, as well as with his tendency to incessant osmosis between his understanding of the causes of natural phenomena and his efforts to reproduce them in visual form. In observing the candle's flame, Leonardo focuses his attention on the smoke produced by combustion. Quote, the smoke is generated in the middle of the candle's flame. The smoke that first originates in the match tipped with the sulfur is blue and spherical. End of quote. It is no way surprising that shape and color, the basic element of visual representation, attract the gaze of Leonardo. In his analysis of the shape of a flame and the movement of the air around it, we observe again the effort to integrate the principles of Aristotle's physics with the results of keen observation and ingenious experiments. Leonardo attempts to understand what keeps the flame constantly agitated and how the process of exchange between the flame and its nourishment takes place. Quote, "The motor of the flame, as it is first generated, does not move by itself, nor does the nourishment of the candle flame. Consequently, that motion is generated by others." End of quote. This introduces the essential function of air, which, quote, "with fury moves to fill the vacuum left by the air previously consumed by the flame." End of quote. Leonardo repeats the operation of lighting a candle with a sulfur match several times to observe the sequence of the phenomena produced. It must be stressed that investigation of this kind has no precedent. The long textual description of the stages of generation of a flame is visually summarized in the margin of our folio by 4 extremely small but remarkably precise drawings. Just to give you an idea, these are 1.5 centimeters high, a very minuscule drawings, but the definition is extremely high. In the first drawing, what Leonardo calls a drop of flame, spherical in shape and blue in color, is generated. In the second stage, near the top of the drop of a flame, a tiny flame of more luminous colors forms. Lastly, the flame proper develops. The smoke which is generated in the flame and discharged along its central axis would tend to expand the shape of the flame were it not contrasted by the external pressure of the air. Quote from Leonardo, the same page. "The air that continuously strikes against it from without and pushes it back causes it to condense, and this condensation makes the flame brighter and more luminous, and the condensed smoke is exhaled from the top of the flame and cannot exit from any other place, because below it finds the matter that has generated it, and on the sides it finds the air that strikes it, and above it finds the rarefied air that rises, and through that air the flame finds its exit." End of quote. Leonardo is fascinated by the dynamic interaction between air, smoke, and flame, which he analyzes in strictly mechanical terms. It is expressly these interactions that transform the apparently insignificant case of the flame of a candle into a phenomenon of great scientific complexity, an extraordinary observatory for viewing nature's universal law into operation. The striking of the air on the top of the candle causes melting of the tallow, which rises through the wick in a continuous process to avoid formation of a vacuum. The complex processes of exchange between the flame, the air, and the tallow of the candle are synthesized again in a small drawing of strikingly clear definition. This is the drawing that also given the image to the title. Is again something of about 2 centimeters in height and a little more than 1 in wide. So spectacular definition, the capacity of sketching in such a small dimension. So many details, as you will notice. In this drawing, the smoke can be seen coming out of the top of the flame, moving vertically upward at first, and then deviating to the sides in spiraling rings that descend with a whirling motion. Through superb etching, Leonardo also shows the currents of air that rise from below along the cylindrical body of the candle and strike against the flame, keeping it from expanding to the sides. After the impact, the air turns back on itself to form hot circling waves that strike against the top of the candle, liquefying the surface of the tallow and thus preparing it to become nourishment for the flame. Further on, Leonardo analyzes the causes that produce a succession of concave and convex lines in the upper contour of the flames generated by candles placed side by side. Again, this description, based on direct observation of lighted candles, is illustrated in a sketch that offers a blow-up of the sections of the top surfaces of burning candles placed side by side. It states that this phenomenon depends on the fact that the tallow liquefies more intensely at the central part of the top of the candle, struck by the whirling air heated by the flame, than on its edges, struck by cooler air. The heated humor that rises upward from the center of the cavity formed at the top of the candle generates flames of concave contour, while that which rises from the edges produces flames of convex profile. In this way, Leonardo explained also the causes of the characteristic bowl-shaped depression around the wick of a lighted candle. It's very clearly suggested in the drawing on your right. It is at this point that Leonardo stresses that his depiction of the interpolations between the whirling motion of the flame, the smoke, and the air currents is not a product of his imagination. He has simply described the phenomena observed through an ingenious experiment. Quote, "But with the experiment of the shadow that the flame casts before the sun, we have seen and found the true motion made by the air when it is penetrated by flame and by the smoke that penetrates the air." End of quote. This extraordinary statement is accompanied by three tiny sketches of air currents. You see the excavation produced by this enlargement, by the whirling motion of the air excavating and giving the bowl shape to the top of the candle. Three tiny sketches of air currents perfectly specular to those illustrating currents of water encountering obstacles in the Codex Leicester. See, look how similar are the way of thinking. Air and water that are striking against objects of square shape, generating rebounds and swirling cowlicks similar to the ones depicted by Leonardo in the beautiful drawing of the motion of air around a candle on our folio. It is important to focus on the experiment that Leonardo reports to have performed, masterfully visualizing its results in this minute drawing. It has to be stressed that the drawing does not portray a burning candle, but its shadow, projected on a screen by sunlight. In this way, drawing becomes a kind of microscope of nature. Equally noteworthy are the paradoxical results of an experiment that generates what could be called the shadow of light. Those shadows that in painting and drawing define relief. This is the most spectacular gradual passage from dark to clear to sunlight in a painting that I think has ever been achieved. The fine relief, the shadow, that make it possible to distinguish shapes and to graduate the brightness of the light, those shadows that Leonardo the painter went so far as to proclaim, these are his words, of power greater than light. He believes the shadows are of power greater than light. becomes in his hand an essential tool of scientific investigation. He's focusing on the determinant role of projection in the production of shadows. You see, these are typical studies of the shadow projection by Leonardo, and the attention devoted to the chromatic and morphological aspects of the flame show how in Leonardo's mind the curiosity of the natural philosopher is intrinsically interwoven with the tension of the artist who strives to found on scientific knowledge the most faithful representation of nature. I know of no historical precedent for the obsessive attention dedicated by Leonardo to the flame of a candle. To find a comparable example, we must wait until the mid-19th century. In winter 1860-1861, a most brilliant and innovative British scientist, the celebrated Michael Faraday, held for an audience of young people at the Royal Institution in London 6 famous Christmas lectures under the title A Chemical History of a Candle. In reading the first of those lessons, one can only be amazed at how strikingly Faraday echoes the analysis conducted by Leonardo. First of all, Faraday explicitly states that the candle's flame offers a thorough compendium of the laws and principles that operate in nature. Quote from Faraday's text: "There is not a law under which any part of this universe is governed which has not come into play and is touched upon in these phenomena." Moreover, the British scientist's brilliant exposition contained a description very similar to that of Leonardo of the bowl-shaped depression that forms around the wick of a burning candle. Quote from Faraday: "You see then that a beautiful cup is formed. As the air comes to the candle, it moves upwards by the force of the currents which the heat of the candle produces, and it so cools all the sides of the wax, tallow, or fuel, and as to keep the edge much cooler than the part within. You see, therefore, that the cup is formed by this beautifully regular ascending current of air." End of quote. Faraday's London lecture contains other statements astonishingly convergent with Leonardo's texts and drawings. Faraday is concerned, for instance, with explaining, quote, "the way in which this fluid gets out of the cup up to the wick and into the place of combustion," end of quote. Which is the same question put by Leonardo to explain the process of continuous nourishment of the flame. Faraday then goes on to examine the shape of the flame, referring to an engraving that shows the action of the currents of air, quote, "which draws the flame out, for the flame that you see is really drawn out by the current and drawn upward to a great height," end of quote. Here too, the problem, the method of analysis, and the recourse to graphic illustration appear symmetrical to Leonardo's approach. But it is in the description of the procedure that allows us to directly perceive the action of the air currents and the smoke that the symmetry reaches its apex. Faraday invites the reader to verify in person these phenomena, invisible to the naked eye, through an experiment. Quote, "You may see these by taking a lighted candle and putting it in the sun so as to get its shadow thrown on a piece of paper. How remarkable it is that that thing which is light enough to produce shadows of other objects can be made to throw its own shadow on a piece of white paper or card, so that you can actually see streaming round the flame something which is not part of the flame, but is ascending and drawing the flame upward," end of quote. Needless to say, this is exactly the same experiment as the one conducted by Leonardo to reveal the action of the invisible forces. Another strong similarity can be seen in Faraday's analysis of the results produced by projecting the shadow of a candle flame. What we see in the shadow, I'm quoting, he observes, as the darkest part of the flame is in reality the brightest part. And in fact, his illustration, as you can see, shows the central core of the flame darker than its outer part, exactly as can be seen in Leonardo's sketches of a candle's flame. Both Faraday's text and this illustration thus confirm that Leonardo's drawings are graphic transcriptions of the evidence observed in projecting the shadows of a flame onto a screen. It can truly be said that Leonardo's drawings contain a mine of information of which we have till now barely scratched the surface. The similarities we have pointed out should not lead us to conclude that Faraday knew of Leonardo's texts, nor should the resounding echoes observed suggest that we add to the many pearls in the multi-stranded necklace of sensational discoveries attributed to Leonardo the jewel of his brilliant anticipation of the modern physics and chemistry of heat and combustion. It is neither a case of plagiarism on the part of Faraday, nor of a new precursor intuition on that of Leonardo. The striking analogies concern, in fact, only the method of investigation. The projection of shadows as a microscope of nature is a truly brilliant idea which was probably suggested to Leonardo by his experience as an artist striving to represent the innermost processes of nature and to rigorously manipulate light and shadow, as shown by his masterfully shaded portraits of the candle flame, the one that we have seen before. We might appropriately define these shadows as shadows of art and science. The light from Leonardo's candle illuminates other instinctive motion of his mind. Leonardo establishes a relationship of direct proportionality between the heat and the brightness of the flame on one side and its splendor and speed on the other. Quote, "Between flames of the same size, the one which is hottest will be the most splendid, and the converse follows. From flames of the same size, the most splendid will be the one that burns fastest." End of quote. Highly interesting, then, are his observations on the colors of the flame, revealing again the vigilant presence of the painter's eye. As mentioned earlier, Leonardo recorded the blue color of the drop of the flame from which the process of combustion starts. On another folio in the Codex Atlanticus, Leonardo specifies that, quote, "the blue flame is midway between the shadow and the light," end of quote. A statement that echoes a precept reiterated in his book on painting. Quote from the book on painting, "Blue and green are not in themselves simple, because blue is composed of light and shadow, like the color of the air that is the most perfect black and the whitest white." End of quote. It is on this basis that Leonardo explains the blue color of the smoke, which in condensing generates the flame. Quote, "Flame is condensed smoke, composed of the concourse of air, which is in itself blue smoke." End of quote. After losing its component of darkness, conferred in the initial stage of combustion by the nourishment that is mixed with the air, white in color, the smoke loses its bluish tinge. The keen eye of the painter accompanies the process of scientific analysis in which Leonardo is engaged. After the initial blue of the smoke, he points out the chromatic metamorphosis of the flame. Quote, "The fiery vapor that is infused in damp smoke darkens the end of the narrow flame, which for this reason becomes reddish and then, at the end, dark red." End of quote. It is hard to decide here whether it is the mind of the natural philosopher or that of the artist indicating the direction of research. No different is the scenario delineated in another block of text entitled "On the Heat That Gathers in the Middle of a Cloud." Here, Leonardo states that the heat lifts a cloud until it meets cool air that oblige it to stop, remaining suspended in perfect equilibrium. To protect itself against the cold, the heat concentrates in the middle of the cloud. But the wind, by mixing heat with cold, breaks this equilibrium and causes destruction of the cloud, from which is generated, these are Leonardo's words, furious raging of water, rain, hail, and wind. End of quote. And wind, end of quote. This topic is briefly resumed on the back of our folio, where attention is shifted from clouds to the motion of wind. It doesn't come as a surprise that Leonardo established a link between clouds and the flame of a candle, since both phenomena depends on the action of heat and cold. The end of the passage quoted above seems, however, to refer to the catastrophic manifestation of the elements masterfully depicted by Leonardo in the famous series of the Deluge drawings, in which apocalyptic spectacles are produced by the combined action of water, flames, and wind. The text on clouds thus provides further evidence of the integrated approach, acquiring knowledge not only to understand physical processes, but also to portray them faithfully, which is a salient characteristic of Leonardo's mind. In this sense, it should be recalled that the entire seventh chapter of Leonardo's famous book on painting, entitled Degli Nuvoli, that is, on clouds, is dedicated to illustrating this atmospheric phenomenon through texts that mirror the analysis conducted by Leonardo on our folio. Very similar processes are moreover described in the Codex Leicester. The analysis of a candle's flame in the Codex Atlanticus enhances other conceptual links which throw light on Leonardo's mental laboratory. Leonardo has already stated that the flame develops by consuming air. To prevent formation of a vacuum, other air replaces that which has been consumed, thus producing an air current. An essential factor because, quote, "when air is not received in the right proportion by flame, no flame can live, nor can any terrestrial animal." End of quote. A little later, he reiterates the same concept, quote, "where flame does not live, nor animal that breathes can live." End of quote. The analogy between combustion and respiration reflects the tendency of Leonardo to subject the phenomena of the inorganic and the organic worlds to the same laws. Here, the analogy is based on the similarity that he perceives between the shape of a flame and that of the heart. After its first manifestation, in which is round in shape and blue in color, a flame assumes, in fact, quote, "the shape of a heart, with a point turned towards the sky." You see on your right the art depicted in his anatomical drawings, manuscripts, and then reversing it, you arrive at illustrating visually the concept corresponding to the text I just quoted. In another folio of his anatomical notebooks, Leonardo returns to the same image. Quote, the immediate rotundity of the flame then stretches upward to take on the shape of a heart, which point is turned to the sky, exactly the kind of effect that they have produced, reversing the drawing of the art. This similarity depends on the pyramidal shape common to both flame and heart. It may be useful to recall that for Leonardo, the pyramidal shape is characteristic of all phenomena involving heat, and thus also of the functions of the heart, the center of vital heart. As Mondino, an author, the famous physician, an author familiar to Leonardo, had pointed out, I quote from Mondino's text, that the art as more heat will be made clear to you in its shape, because it is of pineal, that is pyramidal shape, because anything excessively hot must be of that shape, because the proper shape of the primal heat is a pyramid, end of quote from Mondino. The apparently linear transition from the phenomenology of flame to respiration and the heart suggests that we should search in Leonardo's coeval manuscripts for evidence that helps us to throw light on the complex network of daring connections incessantly established in his mind. In his anatomical studies, particularly in those on respiration and on the heart, which belongs to the same era as our folio, we find many echoes and significant developments of the analogy between the flame of the candle and the art. On a folio datable to 1508, we find strong similarities to the above quoted statement in our folio regarding the essential function of air in combustion and respiration. Quote, the title of this text is On the Lungs. This is moved, that is the lung, by others, that is by the prime mover, that is the art. This, in its contraction, draws back the vessels with which it gives back the heated air to the lung and opens it up. And this lung can close voluntarily or through forgetfulness, that is absent-mindedness, through excessive contemplation. Is a beautiful statement. And by these means, the heart draws back from the lung the heated air which it gave it. But this action cannot be made many times, because if it were not refreshed with new air, the heart would become suffocated. End of quote. Here, what should be stressed primarily is the explicit reference to the impossibility of breathing without air. We should also focus on Leonardo's definition of the heart as the prime mover, which calls to mind the symmetrical function assigned to volcanoes in the bowels of the earth as prime movers of the circulation of the waters on folios in the Codex Atlanticus dating from the same period. On these folios, it delineates his conviction that water in the microcosm and blood in the microcosm carry out the function of instilling life in their respective organism, a process that takes place through the very same mechanical principles: condensation and rarefaction, continuous inputs to avoid the formation of a vacuum, the laws of continuity. On another folio of the same period, dealing with bellows, it has a mechanical instrument whose functioning is comparable to that of the lungs. On a folio on which appear both his famous diving apparatus, you see this is the most famous drawing by Leonardo, the inventor, as well as the model of the heart as a stove. You see, that is the heart for Leonardo, is a stove, input and inlet and in-out entrance of air, consumed and heated. In this folio, Leonardo stresses once more that a continuous exchange of air is necessary both to maintain life and to keep a flame burning. Quote, Short and frequent breathing suffocates that person who breathes, because each breath does not change all the air on the lung that has been heated, but a part of it remains there, so greatly heated that it would do great damage to an animal, unless big and long breaths were to drive it out of the lung. End of quote. Still datable to 1509-10 is another folio at Windsor, on which there returns the image of the, on which there returns the image of the heart as a stove with valves for the intake and discharge of air, and of the lung and the trachea as the bellows and the chimney, respectively, which renew the air and expel that which has been combusted. Here, Leonardo applies his universal law of continuity, according to which the speed of air passing through ducts is inversely proportional to the section of the ducts. For Leonardo, the same law applies to water flowing in rivers, to blood in the arteries, as well as to the flames that develop in pipes and flues. If the lungs serve to exchange air heated by the heart with fresh air, the heart is the center of heat production. This helps us to understand why Leonardo, fascinated by the Galenic concept of the necessary correspondence between the form of the organs and their functions, sees between the candle's flame and the heart that strong morphological analogy which appears to us anything but intuitive. Nature, Leonardo points out, has appropriately surrounded the fiery heart with the cooling humor contained in the pericardium. Furthermore, it justifies the muscular structure which, with penetrative intuition, he attributes to the heart by the fact that muscle fiber is highly resistant to heat, quote, so that fire can hardly damage it, end of quote. Nature has fabricated the fundamentally important cardiac organ in this particular way, that is in muscle fiber, quote, so that it should be able to resist the great heat which is generated in the left side of the heart through arterial blood, end of quote. The heart's resistance to heat also finds confirmation, quote, in the case of men who have been burnt, in whom, through their bones have been, though their bones have been burnt to ashes, the heart is still bloodily inside, end of quote. Leonardo may well echo here the Florentine legend that after Savonarola had been burned at the stake in 1494, his heart was found intact amongst the ashes of his body. Further evidence reveals the deep penetration into Leonardo's mind of the analogy between the heart, but also the lungs and respiration, and the flame of a candle. A long anatomical text, datable to 1510, bears a title that seems to introduce a philosophical program. This is the title, How the Body of an Animal Continuously Dies and is Reborn, end of quote of the title. And in fact, the issue dealt with is one of crucial importance. It is a question of deciphering the mechanism that regulate the flow of life, suspended between the past, which no longer exists, the present, which is already fading away the moment it comes into existence, and the future, which does not yet exist. Leonardo wonders what is that ensures life its unbroken continuity, although life is based on a process that seems discontinuous, an endless succession of deaths and resurrections. Quote, the body of anything that is nourished continuously dies and is continually reborn. For nourishment cannot enter except into those places where past nourishment has been exhausted. And if it is being exhausted, it no longer has life. Unless, therefore, you supply nourishment equal to the nourishment which has departed, life fails in its vigor. And if you take away this nourishment, life is totally destroyed. But if you supply just as much nourishment as is destroyed daily, then as much life is reborn as is consumed. Just as the flame of the candlelight is made from the nourishment from the humor given to it by the candle. As this light itself is also continually renewed by swiftest succor from beneath, by as much as is consumed above in dying. And in dying, the bright light is converted into murky smoke. And at each instant, the whole light dies and it is completely regenerated together with the movement of its nourishment, and its life furthermore receives from its flux and reflux. The same thing happens in the body of animals. By means of the beating of the heart, which generates a wave of blood through all the vessels which continually dilate and contract. I say that the flesh of animals is being continuously remade from the blood which is continuously generated from their nourishment, and that this flesh is destroyed and returns through the mesenteric arteries and pass into the intestines, where it putrefies in foul and fetid death, as their expulsions and thick steam shows us, like the smoke of the flame of the candle given as a comparison. End of quote. This is an extraordinary text in which the nobility of the concept urges Leonardo to elevate the tone of his prose. But above all, it is crucially important text for fully understanding both the genuine significance of the analogy between the candle's flame and the heart, and the mode in which Leonardo's mind confronts the theme of life and as a dynamic transformation, as unstable balance between generation and destruction, according to the principles and laws that hold true for mankind as well as for the inorganic world. Even the vocabulary evokes here the statements on the flame of the candle in our folio. Now, nor are there lacking explicit reference to the other term of comparison that is always present when Leonardo confronts the great subject of life, namely the microcosm. Unmistakable allusion to it appear in the mention of the ebb and flow of life, calling to mind the pages in the Codex Leicester illustrating the mirror-like symmetry between the body of a man and the body of the heart. These echoes and other folios in the Codex Atlanticus, same time, same years, in which Leonardo compares respiration with the ebb and flow of the sea, establishing through complex calculations a proportional relationship between the rhythm of the lungs' breathing and that of the tides. It is not by accident that on this folio we find again a drawing of the merging flame of 4 candles. Quote, "From where does the condensation or rarefaction of smoke and of flame originate? That part of the smoke which is closest to its point of origin most closely conserves its nature." End of close. End of quote. A similar question is found in manuscript F, belonging to the same period, where we are no longer surprised to observe a candle's flame depicted in its radiant evanescence. And the text that you see there reads in English, "Observe the light and consider its beauty. Blink your eye and look at it. That which you see was not there at first, and that which was there is no more. What is it who makes it anew if the maker dies continually?" End of quote. This text, inspired by Ovid's Metamorphoses, seemed to echo the equally solemn and fully consonant philosophical maxim in the earlier Codex Tribultianus. quote, "The water that you touch in a river is the last of that which has passed and the first of that which is coming. So with time present," end of quote. To conclude our voyage through Leonardo's manuscripts, following the trail left by the swaying motion of the candle flame, it is inevitable to ask what this intricate web of bold connections, of continuous shifting from one field to another, of different but coexisting ways of looking at the same object, tells us about Leonardo's mode of thinking, that is, about his mind. We have pointed out that the theoretical basis to which he constantly refers in his causal explanation of the phenomena of flame and heat is provided by Aristotle's physics. But as compared to the method with which this topic is dealt with in the Aristotelian commentaries known to Leonardo, the innovation consists of the concrete presence of a lighted tallow candle on Leonardo's desk. Leonardo observes it, lights other candles, and places them besides it to see how their flames behave together. Moreover, he devises ingenious experiments to detect the invisible phenomena triggered by combustions. Contextual to observation and experimentation, aimed at identifying universal causes, Leonardo tunes into different wavelengths, where other problems emerge. It seems that his mind makes no distinction between understanding in order to discover the universal principles and the mechanical process through which they operate, understanding as an instrument for manipulating nature, and understanding in order to faithfully represent in drawing and painting the marvelous works of nature, the clouds, the morphology and chromatic aspects of flames, winds, and floods. His mind seems constitutionally incapable of conducting investigation that unfold along linear tracks. Striking connections based on analogies of structure, morphology, movement, or behavior steer it towards alternative routes, where it makes in-depth incursions. This gives rise to clusters of problems that prospect hybridization at times incomprehensible to us, but they cling together according to a higher logic. Given that the most conspicuous part of these reflections on flames and related issues may be dated to the years around 1510, we find further confirmation of what recent investigation seems to indicate, that these were the years when Leonardo's attempt at unifying the whole body of knowledge of man and nature under a few universal principles reached its most advanced level. On this unified body of knowledge, he intended to base the daring project of the scientific foundation of painting. Only a few years later, the force of this extremely powerful synthetic vision was to progressively fade. The analogy, for instance, between man's respiration and that of the earth was to be abandoned. And the same thing was to happen as regards the strong relationship he had established between the mechanical action of the waters on our planet on one end, and that of the blood in the human body on the other. There then follows a phase in which Leonardo seems increasingly aware that in the pictorial representation of nature, it is necessary to come to some compromise with strict scientific paradigms, the hand of the painter being materially incapable or perfectly matching the impulses of thoughts. Thus, the investigation of the shadow of light offers a perfect portrayal of the mature Leonardo's project for unifying all natural phenomena under a few common principles. The daring connection stimulated by the burning candle helps us to grasp the tensions and expectations which nourished Leonardo's mind. Thank you. Sorry? Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Galluzzi. I couldn't help thinking as I was listening, and while you were thinking of some questions which you might want to ask Professor Galluzzi, I was always a little bit skeptical of books which call themselves Only Connect, like John Sherman's great book on 15th and 16th century painting in Italy. And then just last night, I was looking at the favorite quotations of the very distinguished historian of the environment, William Cronon, and there at the top was Only Connect. And I've been puzzling just in the last 24 hours why this injunction. And I think, Paolo, this evening you have given us as good an illustration as any of the sense of that motto through someone who at the end of his career tried to make everything hang together. Thank you so much for that. Now you must have some questions. Here.
That was wonderful, thank you.
Do we have a microphone? Yeah.
Oh, where?
I'm asking you all one question each and keep it short. This is the rules of the House.
Do you think Leonardo eventually intended to publish this, or as he was working on this, was that part of what he was ultimately trying to do? Or did he have a sense of audience as he was writing this?
We have no real evidence of any serious project of arriving at the printed format of these reflections. The most advanced in this sense is the Madrid Codex I, that has a layout that is inspired directly from a printed format page. No, I think that this is Leonardo certainly thought of printing something, but he never arrived at a level close to that goal. So these are still direct investigation with a very quick registration. You may observe the page is full of corrections and is very quickly written. When he wanted to be more clear, he could write in a more transparent way. Very difficult to read these pages because he comes in many times, he stops and starts again. So this is not destined in this phase to publication. But he's still cultivating, and all these manuscripts are full of reference. See the first book on force. See the river flow book, chapter 16. We are lost in this reference because we are missing also 60% of what he wrote. But I think it was more a desire than the real project that approached seriously.
Listening to your wonderful talk, I could not help but raise a question in my mind. And the question, very briefly put, is Leonardo's religiosity in the context of early 16th century Italian culture. On the one hand, the subjects of his paintings are very often religious in nature. On the other hand, the statements in his notebooks, some of which you've given us tonight, raise questions or open new possibilities of defining religiosity. And I wonder if we could have your reflections on this subject.
You will never find Leonardo declaring explicitly if he believes or not believes. But it's pretty obvious that he doesn't believe in the official religion. He has a kind of religion of nature. He believes that nature is a rational, in a rational vision of nature as a supreme authority. The word God is, if I am not wrong, used only twice in a phraseological sense, not in a theological sense. So he believes that nature is a coherent rational system that man can decipher. He wouldn't have accepted that it's impossible to know nature. He wouldn't have accepted that only through holy text you can arrive understanding truth. But there is never explicit. And the fact that we often forget that the enormous series of drawings that he makes from anatomy, from direct inspection of the human body, is the earliest testimony of the desecration, of the mechanization of the human body that was something very, very difficult to admit from the Catholic Church. And in fact, in 1513, when he was in Rome, he was also denounced. He was working in the Hospital of Santo Spirito, making dissections, and he was also denounced by one of his servants, and he was compelled to stop because, I mean, and plus he makes a series of skull dissections. So he goes in the very sacred part of the body more than the other that were less delicate. But he goes into the brain. He tried to mechanize the human machine, and this is something that has no precedent. And of course, it's not really something that you can imagine well received by the official religious authorities.
Thank you. I would like to ask about Leonardo's education. You showed a slide of Archimedes. You mentioned Ovid. Could you expand on that, please?
Leonardo starts, as many of his artist colleagues, with no formal education, but he has a process of growing involvement into official culture, with trainers that he meets occasionally. Anatomy, Marcantonio della Valle, while he's in Milan, is a professor of anatomy in Pavia, become friends and start learn through frequenting him. Later on, as making reference to your specific question, Euclid and Archimedes, is the fact that in 1494, when Leonardo is already in Milan since 12 years, Luca Pacioli, a great mathematician, arrives in Milan. He is another Tuscan scholar, and he becomes very close to Leonardo. And we have evidence in his notebooks of the lessons that he starts making to understand Euclid. And later on, he will become more ambitious and will try to find Archimedes. And there is a note in which he says that the Bishop of Padua has an Archimedes. This is an indication that he was looking for putting his hands on somebody. But of course, he couldn't access Greek, but yet friends could help him. So he becomes more and more an humanist. But he started from scratch. And at the end, there is a legend that has passed to us thanks to Benvenuto Cellini, that in his vita, in his life, Cellini tells of the great recognition that Leonardo had achieved to reach. And he tells the tale, is a tale that Francis I, one of the most important monarchs, at the point of Leonardo's death, Leonardo was in France, in Amboise, moved from Paris to attend the passing of these venerated artists. And Cellini reports the statement that Francis I would have pronounced. He was sad not because was lost a great artist, not because was lost a great engineer, but because a great philosopher had passed away. So this means that the metamorphosis from the young Leonardo to this very final image that has become a humanist. And is the first artist that has strived and obtained, at least at the level of image, to make this transformation.
Professor Benelli.
Thank you very much for this lecture. And I have a specific curiosity about this drawing here that tell us that Leonardo was very few steps away, or maybe he was aware of the laws that allowed aerodynamic objects to fly. You know, he could have simply noticed that putting a piece of paper over the flame. So I was wondering whether these specific studies on the candle combustion can be contextualized in his studies of the Trattato del Volo degli Uccelli or his flying machine.
Yes, it is certainly. There is there is a reference in the Codex on the Flight of Birds. It's about 4 or 5 years before the the date of this sheet, in which he makes a comparison both between flying and swimming, and study the way in which the fish float, and you will have the flight of the birds. So we would call fluid mechanics today, a field of this kind. And there is a small reference to the fact that heat affects very much the phenomena of flying. But it doesn't go beyond that. It stays. I think that Leonardo's mind is a bit fragmentary. It skips, it jumps from, as we have seen in this lecture, from one field to the other, but it is unable to stop for over a long period on just looking at the phenomena of the candle. This triggers a immediate change of scenery and trying to find connections, but never goes. What we have is these 4 pages. It's very uncommon that you have 4 pages continuously dealing with the same topic in all the Leonardo's manuscripts that has passed to us. Quite an uncommon thing. Generally, small statement followed by a totally different topic in a still few statements.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful lecture. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what you alluded to in terms of the kind of compromises that he had to make, and you said that by, later on, the vision of the unified nature faded. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, what kind of evidence we have for that, and how it affected, in fact, his painting and his natural explorations.
Sure. In the late manuscripts, both in the late, after 1513, 1213, he apparently becomes more and more aware that his design, his project of unifying under a few principles all the phenomena, organic and inorganic world, and guided at the end of portraying that in a painted or in a sketched form, is difficult to maintain and to give coherence. So he explicitly states in a passage of a manuscript of the 1515 that the movement of the waters on the planet and the movement of the blood in the human body are different phenomena. He still applies the laws of continuity. The laws of continuity, this is his definition, is the idea that when you have a flow of whatever is a flow, air, blood, water, and you have one branch that is going, if you get a diversion, the section will be the two sections. If you sum the two sections, you will have exactly the same dimension. And this explains all the lymphatic system in this way. He explained that through the river diversion into minor courses altogether. This is abandoned, and he says that it's impossible that it goes like that because in the Earth other factors enters into play. So there is no total denial of what he was saying before, but we have plenty of evidence in the last 5 years of his life that is now accepting that the painter has to find, because it's the painting approach that obliges him to make that, because everything is made, consider that all the anatomical drawings are inner part of the body. All the tradition of the study of anatomy and the painters is on external appearance, because you do not reproduce the organs, you reproduce the surface. So you want to go beyond that limit because you want to know how it works. And he believes that only knowing how it works, you can really get the science of painting. He calls painting a science. He put painting at the top of all the form of knowledge. This confidence goes fading progressively, especially in the 5 last years of his life, when he comes in more in the idea that science is a bit different from painting, and that painting cannot be the science exactly as mechanics or optics that are developed science at Leonardo's time. So it never states this, but it's pretty obvious by many statements pertaining to the last years that he has lost confidence, at least, in this very, very Renaissance idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm altogether.
One last question, and then we can. Well, two more questions. I see you go first, and then you.
This may be a small point, Professor, but I couldn't help but notice that in Leonardo's beautiful drawings, his wicks appear to be unusually long, 2 or 3 times the length of Faraday's, for example.
Yeah. Do you want to know why?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I can tell you how these things were done. They were built around. They had a container. They were putting the animal fat inside, the pig fat generally, and they, from the very beginning, they had a wick in that. So this is probably casual, and may also be that the real candle had a smaller one, and that he wanted to emphasize all the role in making it bigger in the portrait. But I have no a precise reply to your question. Because it's not always the same. It's generally right in this one, but in other drawings, as you see the 3 small drawings that I was analyzing, the wick is much smaller. So I think it's the purpose of demonstration that it makes alter the height of the wick.
Your lecture was both so clear and so inspiring that I think it's made it particularly difficult to stay within the house rules. So here is a question. I think it's Vasari, but many here will correct me, who records that much later that Michelangelo is asked what is the most beautiful form. And he says, well, I don't know, but I've always thought that it was either the so-called figura serpentinata. He says, no, it is la fiamma. No? And he goes on to describe it in ways that are absolutely congruent with what you were telling us. And of course, many people here know that the whole idea of pyramide, no? And pyro, that there was a false Renaissance etymology that conflated, it made the pyramid the emblem of fire and connected to it.
It's coming from Plato.
That's right, exactly. And first you showed us which of course Faraday didn't have interested in pyramids, but the very fact that Leonardo makes the candles form a pyramid, and then the last flame, however you showed us, is a figura serpentinata. My question is whether you think there is a direct contact, or in what is the matrix, what is the tradition in which both of these statements or iterations occur?
I am unable to give you a reply as to Michelangelo. Of course, was not a direct reading, because the theory of the figura serpentinata that you can find implicitly in the treatise, the book on painting of Leonardo, which is the effect of the mechanical forces. They do not act all together, but are in succession, and so the flame is waving and is create this beautiful curved figure, as you can see in that drawing, and also whirlings, beautiful whirlings. I don't think that Michelangelo might have taken inspiration from Leonardo. Of course, everybody knows that they were not very good terms each other, and it's also almost impossible that he can have access to this statement. It is impossible. It's not almost impossible. Michelangelo may have had access to this, but the tradition of the piramide ondulata is true. Is a tradition that comes into in the human figure. If you think of Leonardo's ladder, is a flame that is undulating, is a natural form, is the idea that also a human figure pertains to that. And think of the pose of many sculpture and drawings. Leonardo's Leda is one of the most telling in this sense. We do not have the original Leda, we have drawings and we have copies from the lost original Leda, and it's really a flame and the spiraling movement that is coming. But I insist, I'm not so familiar with the theory of art in the late 15th, early 16th century to be able to reply to your question.
Well, thank you very much once more.